Napoleon's regime was based on secret police, and the secret police chief was Fouché, a royalist minister called Fouché a hyena in human clothes. Fouché had stated his post under the Directory of the Consulate in the Empire and the restored Bourbon monarchy. Fouché was almost as tenacious as J. Edgar Hoover. It took a Bonaparte to bring Fouché's methods to America under the sponsorship of the Anglophile Teddy Roosevelt. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was built up over the years by Charles Bonaparte and J. Edgar Hoover, and it is a key component of the base of support for the conservative revolution in this country. As for Teddy, he was a personal union of secessionists with Anglophile New York financiers. Teddy's father was a Dutch patroon linked to Barings Bank, and his mother was from the Bullock family, which had produced the Confederate commerce raider Alabama with the help of the British. Wall Street and the plantation elite were now united in the Teddy Roosevelt regime.
An assassin's bullet paved the way for yet another Bonaparte to trample across the stage of American history. This time, however, not as an outsider attempting to destroy the Republic, but as the Attorney General of the United States. The consequences were no less treasonous. On September 6, 1901, while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, President William McKinley was shot twice at point-blank range. He died 8 days later. McKinley was the last of the true American system presidents. His assassin, Leon Czolgosz, was from the British Lord Palmerston Mazzini's zoo of anarchists and terrorists. He admitted to police after his arrest that he was a disciple of Emma Goldman, whose Henry Street settlement house in New York City had been identified prior to the shooting by New York City Police Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino as a center of assassination threats against the president. McKinley committed a fatal error when he capitulated to pressure from his enemies within the Republican Party and named the rabid Anglophile Teddy Roosevelt as his vice presidential running mate in the 1900 elections, following the death of Vice President Garrett Hobart. With the decision to place Roosevelt on the ticket, President McKinley placed himself in the British crosshairs. On September 23, 1901, Theodore Roosevelt took the oath of office as President of the United States. The nation has never been the same since. Soon after stepping into the presidency, Roosevelt turned to his longtime friend and fellow mugwump, Charles Joseph Bonaparte, to assume a number of posts in the executive branch. But it was only after Roosevelt was actually elected president in 1904 that he dared appoint a member of the Bonaparte family to a cabinet post. Bonaparte first served as the Secretary of the Navy, but in December 1906, Roosevelt appointed him as Attorney General of the United States. The two men did not waste any time in launching their own Bonapartist putsch. In 1908, Roosevelt and Bonaparte created a national secret police agency which leading congressional opponents of the day quite rightfully equated with the Tsarist Okhrana and the feared secret spy service of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte's police minister, Joseph Fouché. Later known as the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the Bureau of Investigations was established on July 1st, 1908 by executive fiat while the U.S. Congress was out of session and preoccupied with the upcoming national elections. The story of the founding of the FBI by Roosevelt and Bonaparte will sound particularly familiar to those who have experienced the police boot of COINTELPRO, Frumention, Abscam, Brylab, Waco, Ruby Ridge, the Office of Special Investigations, so-called Nazi hunts, the Get LaRouche Strike Force, and Whitewater Gate. On December 17, 1906, Charles Joseph Bonaparte was confirmed by the United States Senate as President Theodore Roosevelt's Attorney General. As one of his first acts in office, Bonaparte launched an attack against a number of Western states' congressional leaders, whom he accused of participating in a land fraud scheme involving the selling off of mineral-rich federal lands. Using an 1892 provision, he, quote, borrowed a team of investigators from the Secret Service, from the Postal Service, and the Interior Department to carry out the probe. Unbeknownst to most people at the time, Bonaparte also employed a team of private detectives under the direction of William J. Burns to conduct a secret parallel probe. Burns's detectives carried out break-ins, blackmail, and extortion, and fabricated evidence to secure the indictments of a number of leading public figures, including Senator John H. Mitchell and Representative John L. Williamson, both of Oregon. A half-dozen prominent elected officials and civil servants were convicted in 1907. The convictions would all be overturned 4 years later when the Taft administration discovered Burns's flagrant criminal acts. But in 1907, the land scam affair was a hot political issue, and Attorney General Bonaparte went to the Congress to seek added police powers. He asked Congress to approve the creation of a Bureau of Investigations in the Office of the Attorney General. The 60th Congress was so horrified at the prospect of a federal secret police that by May 27, 1908, both houses had approved an amendment to the Sundry Civil Appropriations Act forbidding the Attorney General from even borrowing investigators from other federal agencies ever again. The congressional leaders of the fight argued correctly that federal law specifically defined the powers of the Secret Service and other federal police, and that their employment by the Attorney General circumvented those restrictions. In impassioned debate in the House Appropriations Committee on Bonaparte's demand for the creation of a new federal police agency, one member after another stood up to denounce the idea. Congressman Fitzgerald of New York railed that it has, quote, never been the policy to establish a central police or spy system in the federal government, unquote. Congressman Waldo of New York addressed the full House, quote, the only question here before the House is whether we believe in a central Secret Service bureau such as there is in Russia today. I believe that it would be a great blow to freedom and to free institutions if there should arise in this country any such great central Secret Service bureau, unquote. Congressman Smith of Iowa warned that, quote, no general system of spying upon and espionage of the people, such as has prevailed in Russia, in France under the Empire, and at one time in Ireland, should be allowed to grow up. The Chicago press warned of the dangers of an American version of Joseph Fouché, the Duke of Otranto, who was, quote, used by Napoleon to intimidate everyone else in the French Empire and grew so powerful that he intimidated the emperor himself by reason of the state secrets he held. Roosevelt personally railed against the congressional opponents of a federal secret police, writing to Speaker of the House Joseph G. Cannon that, quote, there is no more foolish outcry than this against spies. Only criminals need fear our detectives. The New York Times joined Roosevelt in assailing the Congress. In an editorial titled Tools of Thieves, the Times wrote on the eve of the Senate vote, quote, it was the combination of land sharks that persuaded the Appropriations Committee to approve and the House to pass the amendment to the Sundry Civil Bill. The representatives have, however, unwittingly become the tools of thieves. The senators are duly warned. Despite the Times warnings, the amendment sailed through the Senate. 3 days later, Congress adjourned for 6 months. On July 1st, 1908, a month to the day after Congress left town, Roosevelt and Bonaparte, by executive fiat, created the Bureau of Investigation, expressly against the will of Congress. The very first target of the BOI were Roosevelt's leading congressional opponents. When the 60th Congress returned and launched investigations into the Attorney General's actions, many congressmen found that they were targets of BOI surveillance, break-ins, and mail theft. Roosevelt was personally accused of deploying Bonaparte and the BOI to gather blackmail against his congressional rivals. Roosevelt publicly denied the charges, claiming that his detectives would never violate the law by opening other people's mail. But, Roosevelt added, quote, "Sometimes, through the accidental breaking of such a mail package, the contents are exposed." He then promptly released to the press a series of private letters of Senator Benjamin R. Tillman of South Carolina, a leader in the congressional fight against the BOI and one of Roosevelt's most strident policy opponents. Bonaparte appeared personally before the Congress to defend the BOI, and he was as arrogant as Roosevelt. After blaming Congress for forcing him to create the BOI due to the ban imposed by the Sundry Civil Service Amendment, he railed, "Anybody can shadow me as much as they please. They can watch my coming in and my going out. I do not care whether there is somebody standing at the corner and watching where I go or where I do not go." The final word before Congress's ultimate capitulation to the onslaught of Roosevelt-orchestrated newspaper propaganda and the BOI's relentless blackmail came from Congressman Shirley. Quote, "In my reading of history, I recall no instance where a government perished because of the absence of a Secret Service force, but many there are that perished as the result of the spy system. If Anglo-Saxon civilization stands for anything, it is for a government where the humblest citizen is safeguarded against the secret activities of the executives of the government. The Fourth Amendment declares the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. The view of government that this called into existence is not lightly to be brushed aside." Who were these men who perpetrated this trampling of the Fourth Amendment and far worse? Roosevelt and Bonaparte together personified the post-Lincoln drive by the British-led European oligarchy, specifically the Anglo-French Entente Bestiale, to reconquer the United States. Much has been written in our publications about Theodore Roosevelt, so let us concentrate briefly on Charles Joseph Bonaparte. Charles Joseph Bonaparte was born on June 9, 1851, the second son of Jerome Beau Napoleon Bonaparte and Susan May Williams. We've already been introduced to Beau, the offspring of the brief marriage between Napoleon's youngest brother, Jerome, and the American Elizabeth Patterson. One of the most dominant influences in Charles Joseph's life was his grandmother, Elizabeth Patterson. She lived well into her 90s and was the source of the family's wealth and aristocratic connections. Elizabeth Patterson never for one moment abandoned the idea that her son Beau was a rightful heir to the French Empire. They both took up French citizenship. She forced Napoleon I to approve a 60,000 franc a year stipend, which after the death of her ex-husband Jerome was increased to 90,000 francs. Even after the death of Napoleon I, she tried unsuccessfully to marry Beau off to the dwarfish daughter of one of Napoleon's older brothers, Joseph. Elizabeth Patterson hated the United States. She hardly forgave Beau when he married an American woman, Susan May Williams, of a prominent and wealthy Connecticut family. Madame Bonaparte spent most of her time traipsing around the salons and palaces of Europe, cavorting with the French and British nobility, and cultivating intimate relations with the likes of Madame de Staël, Bishop Talleyrand, and the Duke of Wellington. As we've already seen, Albert Gallatin, the Jeremy Bentham agent who served as U.S. Secretary of the Treasury and as ambassador to the Court of St. James and to France, was another longtime friend and important sponsor. Madame's sentiments were expressed characteristically in a letter that she wrote to her father on September 2nd, 1815, during a visit to England. She spoke of the United States as, quote, a country where I never was appreciated and where I can never be content. In Europe, she was, quote, cherished, visited, respected, and admired. She traveled, quote, in the first society and in the sphere and in contact with modes of life for which nature intended me. Elizabeth Patterson's only son, Beau, died before she did, and thus Charles Joseph Bonaparte and his much older brother, Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte, inherited a fortune valued well into the millions of dollars each, not to mention one of the largest portfolios of prime Baltimore County real estate. While Charles has been described by family biographers as the American in the family, his older brother, Jerome Napoleon, was a Francophone to the bone. After graduating from West Point in 1851, the year that Charles Joseph was born, Jerome moved to France to serve in the French army of his cousin, Napoleon III. He only returned to the United States late in life. He had renounced his U.S. citizenship to pursue his and his grandmother's dreams of taking a rightful place in the French imperial line of succession. Charles Joseph Bonaparte was groomed to assume a prominent position within the self-styled American aristocracy, a caste of wannabe oligarchs dominated by blood relatives and agents of the leading European oligarchical families. He was shipped off to Harvard College in 1869, graduating from the law school 5 years later. He moved into the family's mansion at 601 Park Avenue in Baltimore and began a gentleman's law practice, largely preoccupied with management of the family's real estate holdings. Bonaparte loathed the common man and detested the American system, which had created a new strata of wealthy entrepreneurs whose fortunes had not been inherited but earned. A journalist of the day described Bonaparte as, quote, an aristocrat to the last detail, with his inherited hatred of the vulgar and greedy rich. At his funeral, a lifetime friend observed, quote, it is doubtful whether there was another man in the country at all comparable to him in wealth and position who had so little to do as he with corporations or with their stocks, their bonds, or their other securities. Bonaparte became a leading mugwump reformer. In 1881, he was a founder of the National Civil Service Reform League. It was through the League that he first made the acquaintance of a man of remarkably similar upper-crust pretensions, young Theodore Roosevelt. For Bonaparte, civil service reform was driven by the conviction that all politicians are inherently corrupt and purely out to advance their own self-interest. Only a civil service manned by men of wealth and social station, elevated above the whims of the political class, could govern effectively. He described the political patronage system as, quote, an asylum for political bums. His opponents derided him as the peacock of Park Avenue, and as Soup House Charlie after he equated universal education with free soup kitchens, both of which he detested. In Bonaparte's view, immigrants were, quote, a crowd of strangers of unsavory antecedents or unpromising aspect. Quote, men are by nature notoriously unequal, he wrote in an essay for the Maryland Law Review, in strength, courage, energy, foresight, and self-restraint. And from these inequalities naturally flow inequalities in their wealth, eminence, and happiness. Bonaparte was an adamant opponent of the notion of equality, especially in the field of education. The time he wrote, given to acquiring crude notions about history or physics or learning to mispronounce a few words of one or two foreign languages, is lost to preparations for the serious business of life. Children of our laboring classes leave school ignorant of much they would find of value because they've been taught instead what they will never use. We need not mold our institutions to bring out the Franklins. They are able to take care of themselves. But Bonaparte saved his real venom for the criminal class, which for him, of course, included virtually all elected public officials. Quote, morbid shrinking from the use of physical force against evildoers is a moral malady of the age. Need a body cry if an officer's revolver does now and then save our courts the trouble of trying a burglar and cut off his chances of burgling again when released or escaped from prison? He continued, Judge Lynch makes many mistakes, and his mistakes can be corrected by no writ of error. But if the number of failures of justice in his court could be compared with those in our more regular tribunals, I am not sure that he need fear the results. I believe that very few innocent men are lynched, and of those who have not committed the past offenses for which they suffer, a still smaller proportion are decent members of society. It is, of course, an evil that the law should be occasionally enforced by lawless means, but it is, in my opinion, a greater evil that it should be habitually duped and evaded by means formerly lawful. It's no wonder that of all the posts to which America's leading Bonapartist would be appointed by President Roosevelt, Secretary of the Navy, Special Prosecutor of Fraud within the Postal Service, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, none suited him more than that of Attorney General. Although he today is but a footnote in the history books, his impact has been felt with every new judicial atrocity by the Department of Justice or the FBI, from the Palmer raids to the Red Scares to Frumention to the Get LaRouche strike force.
Abraham Lincoln's plan for the reconstruction of the southern states had never been carried out. Lincoln's plan had been to provide abundant credit for the rapid industrialization of the southern Appalachians and for the rebuilding and upgrading of ruined agriculture. After Lincoln had been assassinated by the British, there had been no credit and no infrastructure for the southern states. The populations that Lincoln had wanted to uplift, develop, and make prosperous remained as sharecroppers and tenant farmers loaded with grinding debt. The planter oligarchy, which had supported slavery and secessionism, had survived and had grown in strength. That planter oligarchy was now ready to send one of its own to the White House. Their candidate was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson called his program the New Freedom, but Wilson was one of the greatest hypocrites of the 20th century. Thanks to Wilson, the Ku Klux Klan soon had 3 to 4 million members out of a U.S. population of just over 100 million, 3%. It has been estimated that at that time, 1 American in 10 was a Ku Klux Klan sympathizer.
In 1913, an American diplomat said in a public speech in England, "Blood carries with it that particular trick of thought which makes us all English in the last resort. We are Puritans and Pilgrim and Cavalier. Despite the fusion of races and the great contributions of other nations to her 100 millions of people, the United States is yet English-led and English-ruled." With these words, Woodrow Wilson's ambassador to England, Walter Hines Page, signaled President Wilson's overthrow of the American Revolution. Wilson put the USA back under the British Empire's power. He ended the protective tariff, put in British-dictated free trade, and made up for the tariff revenue by starting the income tax. Wilson brought in the Federal Reserve System to print our money, controlled by the Bank of England and its group of central banks. Wilson allied the U.S. militarily with Britain and its French puppet for the First World War insanity. His League of Nations ultimately failed, but Wilson's regime effectively launched Britain's scheme for a one-world government. To complete this Anglo-Saxon counter-revolution, President Wilson brought back the Ku Klux Klan, reviving a project of his family from the 1870s. Thomas Woodrow Wilson, he later dropped the Thomas, was born in Virginia and grew up in the South during and after the Civil War. His mother and her brother James, the Woodrows, came from England. Young Woodrow Wilson's home life revolved around England's sponsorship of the Southern Rebellion, with British newspapers and books and all things English in the house. His father, Joseph Wilson, and his uncle, James Woodrow, founded and led the Confederate Presbyterian Church. Revered Uncle James Woodrow was chief of the Confederate Chemical Works in Columbia, South Carolina, and was a powerful banker and church leader after the Civil War. In 1873, Uncle James Woodrow went back to England for a while. He was inducted into the Victoria Institute, headed by Lord Shaftesbury. Uncle James fell in with Thomas Huxley, the manager of Charles Darwin, and Uncle James became an ardent agent for Huxley in America. As the most famous Presbyterian supporter of Darwinism, James Woodrow would come under fierce attack from church conservatives. But Queen Victoria's Institute honored Uncle James for spreading the racist Huxley-Darwin view of evolution. Uncle James was the philosophical model for his adoring nephew and neighbor, Woodrow Wilson. Uncle James wrote, "The Almighty has divided the human race into distinct groups for the purpose of keeping them apart. Where the Caucasian stock has crossed with the others, as in Mexico and South America, an emasculated progeny has followed." In 1876, Uncle James's mentor, Thomas Huxley, addressed the opening ceremonies of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. That new school was Huxley's personal project. Woodrow Wilson and his friends would soon be there, studying Anglo-Saxon racialism. Huxley wrote that no rational man believes that the average Negro is the equal of the white man. It is simply incredible that when our big-jawed relative has no oppressor, he will be able to compete successfully with his bigger-brained and smaller-jawed rival in a contest which is to be carried on by thoughts and not by bites. The Wilsons and the Woodrows supported the Ku Klux Klan war against those loyal to the U.S. government. The Klan forces attacked the black political leaders of South Carolina with methods that are still used today by their faction: slander and false corruption charges. Congressman Robert Smalls, Amelia B. Robinson's great-uncle, was falsely charged with taking a bribe in connection with the pro-civil rights company that did the printing business of South Carolina's state government. The Klan forces set up a rump state government in a showdown with the elected black majority regime of South Carolina. In this crisis, Uncle James Woodrow became famous for running the entire printing operation of the Klan regime, doing the work for free, using his Presbyterian printing house. Woodrow and his money thus helped bring down the legitimate South Carolina government in the Klan coup d'etat. This whole crisis was later viciously lied about by Woodrow Wilson and by his friend from Johns Hopkins, Thomas Dixon, in the movie The Birth of a Nation. Now, the teenaged Woodrow Wilson had a very unique fantasy life. Some of it preserved in the Wilson papers at the Library of Congress. He imagined various British enterprises which he would lead as a British aristocrat. In his fevered Anglomania and bitterness against Yankee government, he wrote that he was Vice Admiral Lord Thomas W. Wilson, Marquis of Huntington, Commander-in-Chief of Her Britannic Majesty's Flying Squadron of Ships. In other memos, he listed the horses and steamships owned by himself as the Marquis, the soldiers commanded by himself as the Duke of Eagleton, the orders for his men in Her Majesty's Royal Rifle Brigade. Wilson wrote up the vessel names, rules, and regulations of the Royal United Kingdom Yacht Club. There was a detailed constitution for this yacht club with special provisions for the patron, Lord Wilson, and other aristocrats. The official Wilson papers commentary explains, "This constitution, fanciful though it was, appears to have been the first of his many frames of government, running straight down to the covenant of the League of Nations." Young Woodrow Wilson wrote a review of John Green's book, History of the English People, for the Princeton University student newspaper. Wilson wrote, "To the American, this book shows the progress of a people whose blood is coursing through his own veins and whose tradition he is proud to claim as his own. We feel that we have lived in the court of every English monarch, from William the Conqueror to Victoria, that we have participated in the conquest of every province of the vast British Empire, that we actually hear the morning drum beat which circles the earth with one continuous and unbroken strain of the martial airs of England. It is a history of the American people as well, for we are a lusty branch of a noble race." Essay on cabinet government in the United States, later the theme of his doctoral thesis in a book. Wilson proposed to correct what he called the grave defects in our mode of government by imposing the British plan. rule by cabinet officers who are members of Congress. He wrote, "Our English cousins have worked out for themselves a wonderfully perfect scheme of government by gradually making their monarchy unmonarchical. They have made of it a republic, steadied by a reverenced aristocracy and pivoted upon a stable throne." Britain's agents picked up Wilson's attack on the corruption of elected leaders, who should be replaced by unelected civil servants. And the empire chose its loyal nephew, Woodrow Wilson, to lead the straying colonies back home. By 1911, Wilson was governor of New Jersey, and his presidential ambition was taken in hand by the British agent, Edward House. House's British father had made a fortune in our Civil War, shipping arms from Britain to Texas to be used against American soldiers. After the Confederate defeat, the House family returned to England, where Edward was raised a British loyalist, despising the United States as an enemy nation. Edward House later came back here to tend his father's Texas cotton plantations and help the British faction of Harriman and Albert Pike take power in Texas. Edward House organized Woodrow Wilson's presidential campaign. Then he brought the British Secret Service directly into the White House to co-manage Wilson's presidency. This is from a book of Wilson's. An edition of Wilson's History of the American People was published in 1912, the year he was elected president. To justify the Ku Klux Klan murders of the 1870s, Wilson wrote, "The white men of the South were aroused to rid themselves by fair means or foul of the intolerable burden of governments sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes. White men of the older order could act only by private combination. They did by intimidation what they were not allowed to attempt by the ballot, by secret concert and association what they could not do in avowed parties. The Klan was an instrument of power," Wilson wrote, "for days of social upheaval when law seemed to be set aside, and outsiders were in the seats of authority. Every countryside wished to have its own Ku Klux, founded in secrecy and mystery like the mother den, until at last there was a great Ku Klux Klan, an invisible empire of the South, to protect the southern country from some of the ugliest hazards of a time of revolution." Wilson defended the murder of school teachers because they wrongly taught the freed slaves to stand up for their rights. Wilson wrote, "Many of the teachers who worked among the Negroes did in fact do mischief as deep as any adventurer. The lessons taught in their schools seemed to be lessons of self-assertion against the whites. They seemed too often to train their pupils to be aggressive politicians and mischief makers between the races. The pro-Klan propaganda movie, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, depicting black legislators as depraved beasts, was partly based on the writings of Woodrow Wilson himself, but mostly on the book The Klansman, written by Wilson's friend, Thomas Dixon. That filthy book had been published by Walter Hines Page of Doubleday Page. Then Page promoted Wilson for president and was made ambassador to England. By arrangement with novelist Thomas Dixon, Birth of a Nation was privately screened in the White House in 1915. President Wilson's ringing endorsement made the film a mammoth American success. And the film On Tour was used to start up a new Ku Klux Klan whose first hatred target was the German Americans, those foreign-born enemies of Anglo-America. Meanwhile, Thomas Dixon's brother, the Baptist preacher Amzie Dixon, was over in England during the Wilson presidency. Reverend Dixon was gathering material for a new British religious movement for America. This imported movement was to be called Christian fundamentalism. Reverend Dixon wrote in favor of mindless literalism, which he called fundamentals of the faith. And his Christian Fundamentals Association spread the word until his fundamentalism had swept American Protestant churches. When the KKK gained millions of members in the northern states during the 1920s, thousands of the Klan leaders were ministers of the so-called fundamentalist churches. It is well to note that Reverend Amzie Dixon's great British patron and Bible study partner was Sir Robert Anderson, official chief of the British Secret Service political spy apparatus operating in America and Ireland. The pious Sir Robert, pioneer of America's new religious fundamentalism, was also head of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Division. He worked with Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, chief of the Quatuor Coronati Masonic Lodge, and they worked together on the notorious cover-up of the Jack the Ripper murders. Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, William McAdoo, who had been Wilson's Treasury Secretary and Federal Reserve Chairman, tried to succeed Wilson in the presidency. In 1924, the National Ku Klux Klan put forward William McAdoo as their nominee at the Democratic Convention. McAdoo's candidacy failed after many ballots, but the McAdoo forces succeeded in stopping the Democrats from speaking out against the Ku Klux Klan. It is this treacherous British legacy which Franklin Roosevelt fought to eliminate from the Democratic Party and against whom we are now successfully waging war against Dirty Dick Morris and South Carolina's racist party chief, Don Fowler.
Now, during the Civil War, the best thing that had happened in Nashville, Tennessee, had been the resounding defeat of General Hood's Confederate Army in late 1864. The Union commander in that fight was General George H. Thomas of Virginia, who had earlier won the title of the Rock of Chickamauga. The Union forces included many loyal residents of Tennessee. The Battle of Nashville represented one of the very few times that an entire Confederate army had been destroyed on the battlefield. Despite this, Nashville soon became a center of evil after 1865. It was in Nashville that the Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1867 by Albert Pike and Nathan Bedford Forrest. World War I and the 1920s were wilderness years for the American Republic, with no visible political faction to represent the nationalist cause after the death of the vacillating Warren G. Harding. During those years, the oligarchical families decided to expand the role of Nashville as an ideological center. These were the patrician families that were waging class war against workers, farmers, and the middle class of the South and the rest of the country. The tools of the oligarchs were racism and the Confederate nostalgia of the lost cause.
In 1905, the Peabody Committee, meeting with President Theodore Roosevelt, Chief Justice William Fuller, and J. Pierpont Morgan, voted to establish in Nashville, in cooperation with Vanderbilt University, then the Southern Methodist's leading school, a teacher's college modeled on John Dewey's Pragmatic Center at Columbia University. In 1915, Vanderbilt completed its divorce from the Methodists and was flooded not only with Vanderbilt and Peabody money, but Carnegie, Rockefeller, whose General Education Board gave it more than any other school for the next 15 years, and later Ford Foundation funds. Now that they owned it, the New York and New England Tories made Vanderbilt their base for relaunching the lost cause of the Confederacy. In 1917, they named Walter L. Fleming, author of the Ku Klux Klan, Its Origin, Growth, and Disbandment, dean. At the same time, students and faculty members, now called the Fugitives after their poetry magazine, began meeting in the salon of Sidney Metatron Hirsch, an artist's model who had toured the avant-garde centers of Europe, the Orient, New York, and Chicago. Hirsch's world was dominated by the cult of Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher of Nazism. Briefly, Nietzsche preached that change occurs in society only through orgies of drunken, violent rage inspired by the Greek god Dionysus, and is only permitted to the race of Übermenschen, supermen like Nietzsche, who rose to the third stage of syphilis, all by himself. William James's and John Dewey's pragmatism preferred fraud to violence, but loved the drunken irrationalism. For them, creativity was insane, and insanity was always uncreative. In 1913, Hirsch had produced a huge Nietzschean pageant in front of Nashville's Parthenon, supported by the business community and starring an ex-governor's wife. A shepherd appeals to Dionysus. 30 black-robed priests, representing the virtues, Hirsch explains, chant, "Justice severe, harden our hearts." 32 white-robed maidens, a KKK rally, or at least what the KK thinks they are when they're dressed up, who Hirsch says represent the vices, plead, "I, tide and the moon, in a lesbian love, strange sisters, cause adamantine hearts to break." In the end, vice triumphs over virtue, and all rejoice. 43 years later, while serving on Dwight D. Eisenhower's National Security Council, Henry Kissinger's teacher, the fugitive William Yandell Elliott, said Hirsch was superior in his political insight to any figure I've known. Fugitives became international literary celebrities. In 1931, Donald Davidson, Alan Tate, and the three fugitive Rhodes Scholars, John Crow Ransom, Robert Penn Warren, and Eliot, published I'll Take My Stand, dedicated to deceased Klan historian Walter Fleming. Members of his department of lynching and cross-burning and others contributed, including the most distinguished contributor, Mississippi aristocrat Stark Young, then living in New York City with his wife, William McKnight Bowman. Their purpose? To support a Southern way of life against the American or prevailing way. Agrarian versus industrial. They liked living by fixed tradition like their heroes, the English, and hated the infinite series of progress. What tradition exactly? Fleming's Jackal, Frank Lawrence Owsley. For 10 years, the South, already ruined by the loss of its $2 billion invested in slaves, was turned over to the 3 millions of former slaves, some of whom could still remember the taste of human flesh, and the bulk of them hardly 3 generations from cannibalism. Andrew Nelson Little, who wrote Bedford Forrest and his Critter Company in honor of the first Grand Wizard of the invisible empire of the Ku Klux Klan, and who later edited the Sewanee Review, one of the leading literary magazines in the United States. Profits do not come from cities. They have always come from the wilderness, stinking of goats and running with lice. The progressive farmer is a contradiction in terms. In the Critter Company, he claimed that Europeans came to America to appease their nostalgia for feudalism, and hailed the Klan as the last brilliant example in Western culture of what feudalism could do. That was published 65 years ago, but I have worse news. After World War II, Robert Penn Warren's sidekick, Cleanth Brooks, another Rhodes Scholar, taught at Yale University, where he fixed up his Klan cheerleaders. We don't know for sure if they ever wore sheets, but we do know about the short skirts and pom-poms. With the aristocratic Buckley brothers, William and F. Reed. This union, cross-fertilized with lapsed communists, launched the Buckleyite conservative movement that's been hitting us with crap for half a century, like the Contract on Americans. In 1991, to celebrate the anniversary of I'll Take My Stand, their Southern Partisan magazine reprinted Frank Owsley's attack on the freed slaves, which you just heard. In January 1996, they commemorated the passing of Andrew Nelson Little by comparing his Critter Company to Homer's epics. Now, back to 1931. Allen Tate. The South had taken root in a native soil. The Southern mind was simple, not top-heavy with learning. How may the Southerner take hold of his tradition? The answer is by violence. Robert Penn Warren, 2 Pulitzer Prizes, 2 Hollywood films, 3 Oscars, first poet laureate of the United States, and John Gould Fletcher, a Pulitzer Prize winner, who is inspired by growing up in the house previously owned by Albert Pike in Fayetteville, Arkansas, at least so he says, attacked universal education and warned against any real education of niggers or other inferior types. That kicked off a 5-year campaign promoting agrarianism. Benito Mussolini's Venetian finance minister, Count Volpi, paid Stark Young to tour Italy and write propaganda which was published in the New Republic magazine here. For this, Young was named Commander of the Order of the Crown of Italy. He wasn't just a homosexual theater critic from New York. He was a lifelong friend of Thomas Huxley's grandson, Julian Sorel Huxley. From 1912 through the First World War, Young and Huxley kept in touch with Colonel Edward House and his family as they planned the League of Nations policy. The New Republic and the New School for Social Research, which they taught at, were the American arm of the British Round Table's New Dark Ages conspiracy, which Carol White wrote a book about some years ago. His modern artsy friends became beatnik and hippie heroes. This included Julian's brother, Aldous, who wrote Brave New World about a society controlled by drugs and popular music and other entertainment, the Nietzschean playwrights Eugene O'Neill and Sherwood Anderson, and decomposer Igor Stravinsky. In 1935, Yandell Elliott, who is now at Harvard University after his Rhodes Scholarship term in Oxford, where he reports that he spent his evenings drinking all night with the occultist poet William Butler Yeats, published The Need for Constitutional Reform. The agrarians supported it in their 1936 book, Who Owns America? A New Declaration of Independence, which was promoted on page 1 of the New York Times Book Review. As Mussolini attacked Ethiopia and Hitler occupied the Rhineland, they supported the Nazi and fascist conquests and demanded that the United States be divided into 10 separate countries. At the same time, Tate, Ransom, Warren, and Brooks founded the New Criticism, which insisted that literature should be judged on the basis of technique alone, without regard for the moral, historical, political, or other ideas involved. You see, they were being slammed for joining goose-stepping Nazi Seward Collins in publishing his American Review magazine. Ever since, journalists, editors, and writers can't pass a course, get a degree, or get a job unless they swallow this or the more radical deconstructionism. Take William Butler Yeats's houseboy, Ezra Pound. He did radio propaganda for Mussolini during the war. Afterwards, he was arrested for treason. But his friends insisted that the Pisan cantos, which he wrote while the army had him locked up, proved that he was too crazy to stand trial. So he was given a salon at St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital, from which he organized Ku Klux Klan and Nazi party rallies in Nashville and elsewhere, and entertained fugitive Alan Tate and his other highbrow friends. In 1949, a Library of Congress commission, including Tate and Robert Penn Warren and T.S. Eliot, who had endorsed I'll Take My Stand some years before at a literary conference in Virginia, gave the first Bollingen Poetry Prize to, guess who? Ezra Pound. For, guess which work? The Pisan cantos. What Tate said about Pound's works is, they aren't about anything, but they are distinguished verse. That's the New Criticism. This is the 1949 movie of Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men, which won 3 Oscars, about Louisiana's Louis XI, Huey Long, who after an international hate campaign, which included editorials by Cleanth Brooks' former roommate, Harding Carter II, calling for the assassination of Huey Long, was shot dead by an associate, or well, an acquaintance of Cleanth Brooks's.
My program. But believe me, there are no strings attached to those deals.
You're sure about that?
Doc, Jack here has been telling me how you feel about things. How you'd like to see the sick people in this state given a break. How you'd like to see a new hospital built. A hospital that's the biggest and best that money can buy. You want those things, Doc, because you're a man who wants to do good. Now I'd like to ask you a question.
Shoot.
Do you know what good comes out of?
You tell me, Mr. Starr.
Out of bad, that's what good comes out of, because you can't make it out of anything else. You didn't know that, did you?
This is not a time for speech-making.
Got what they wanted.
I demand that this bill be passed. Nobody is going to tell me how to run this state.
He started to build the roads, schools, power dams, to change the face of the state from one end to the other. His methods? Politics is a dirty game. And we played it rough and dirty.
You see, Robert Penn Warren still hated industry, but now he was smearing his enemies as fascists. After the war, Eliot chaired the Harvard Government Department and its summer international seminars, which promoted now Sir Henry Kissinger and McGeorge Bundy. They pushed Bertrand Russell's policy of world government to control all industrial development as the only defense against nuclear holocaust. Julian Huxley became an officer of that world government, the first director of UNESCO. What's this done to you? Well, Aeschylus, Plato, Shakespeare, or Schiller inspire you to reflect on what you can do as the recipient of the gifts of past acts of creation to work on enterprises of great pith and moment with consequences for the future of all humanity. This evokes agape. But the new critters ban those reflections. They've made Stark Young's friend William Faulkner, Nobel Prize, 8 Hollywood movies, falling down drunk, the most written about English language author other than Shakespeare. Here's a taste. Temple waked, lying in a tight ball with narrow bars of sunlight falling across her face like the tines of a golden fork. And while the stiffened blood trickled and tingled through her cramped muscles, she lay gazing quietly up at the ceiling. You're a wallowing critter, groping for that warm, fuzzy, natural feeling. Grab a bottle of bourbon or a dose of LSD or both, duck under the covers, you've joined the Ku Klux Klan. If you tolerate the United Nations or agrarianism, now called environmentalism, if you support different education for different races, like Penn Warren and John Gould Fletcher did, if you support contract on Americans, you're in bed with the Ku Klux Klan, which means you're in bed with the hippie, rock, drug, sex counterculture. You say you're not? You say you support family values. Sorry, you should have checked under the sheets.
The United States Senate as President Theodore Roosevelt's Attorney General. As one of his first acts in office, Bonaparte launched an attack against a number of Western states' congressional leaders, whom he accused of participating in a land fraud scheme involving the selling off of mineral-rich federal lands. Using an 1892 provision, he, quote, borrowed a team of investigators from the Secret Service, from the Postal Service, and the Interior Department to carry out the probe. Unbeknownst to most people at the time, Bonaparte also employed a team of private detectives under the direction of William J. Burns to conduct a secret parallel probe. Burns's detectives carried out break-ins, blackmail, and extortion, and fabricated evidence to secure the indictments of a number of leading public figures, including Senator John H. Mitchell and Representative John L. Williamson, both of Oregon. A half-dozen prominent elected officials and civil servants were convicted in 1907. The convictions would all be overturned 4 years later when the Taft administration discovered Burns's flagrant criminal acts. But in 1907, the land scam affair was a hot political issue, and Attorney General Bonaparte went to the Congress to seek added police powers. He asked Congress to approve the creation of a Bureau of Investigations in the Office of the Attorney General. The 60th Congress was so horrified at the prospect of a federal secret police
Napoleon's regime was based on secret police, and the secret police chief was Fouché, a royalist minister called Fouché a hyena in human clothes. Fouché had stayed at his post under the Directory of the Consulate in the Empire and the restored Bourbon monarchy. Fouché was almost as tenacious as J. Edgar Hoover. It took a Bonaparte to bring Fouché's methods to America under the sponsorship of the Anglophile Teddy Roosevelt. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was built up over the years by Charles Bonaparte and J. Edgar Hoover, and it is a key component of the base of support for the conservative revolution in this country. As for Teddy, he was a personal union of secessionists with Anglophile New York financiers. Teddy's father was a Dutch patroon linked to Barings Bank, and his mother was from the Bullock family, which had produced the Confederate commerce raider Alabama with the help of the British. Wall Street and the plantation elite were now united in the Teddy Roosevelt regime.
An assassin's bullet paved the way for yet another Bonaparte to trample across the stage of American history. This time, however, not as an outsider attempting to destroy the Republic, but as the Attorney General of the United States. The consequences were no less treasonous. On September 6, 1901, while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, President William McKinley was shot twice at point-blank range. He died 8 days later. McKinley was the last of the true American system presidents. His assassin, Leon Czolgosz, was from the British Lord Palmerston Mazzini's zoo of anarchists and terrorists. He admitted to police after his arrest that he was a disciple of Emma Goldman, whose Henry Street settlement house in New York City had been identified prior to the shooting by New York City Police Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino as a center of assassination threats against the president. McKinley committed a fatal error when he capitulated to pressure from his enemies within the Republican Party and named the rabid Anglophile Teddy Roosevelt as his vice presidential running mate in the 1900 elections, following the death of Vice President Garrett Hobart. With the decision to place Roosevelt on the ticket, President McKinley placed himself in the British crosshairs. On September 23, 1901, Theodore Roosevelt took the oath of office as President of the United States. The nation has never been the same since. Soon after stepping into the presidency, Roosevelt turned to his longtime friend and fellow mugwump, Charles Joseph Bonaparte, that by May 27, 1908, both houses had approved an amendment to the Sundry Civil Appropriations Act forbidding the Attorney General from even borrowing investigators from other federal agencies ever again. The congressional leaders of the fight argued correctly that federal law specifically defined the powers of the Secret Service and other federal police, and that their employment by the Attorney General circumvented those restrictions. An impassioned debate in the House Appropriations Committee on Bonaparte's demand for the creation of a new federal police agency, one member after another stood up to denounce the idea. Congressman Fitzgerald of New York railed that it has, quote, never been the policy to establish a central police or spy system in the federal government, unquote. Congressman Waldo of New York addressed the full House, quote, the only question here before the House is whether we believe in a central Secret Service bureau such as there is in Russia today. I believe that it would be a great blow to freedom and to free institutions if there should arise in this country any such great central Secret Service bureau, unquote. Congressman Smith of Iowa warned that, quote, no general system of spying upon and espionage of the people, such as has prevailed in Russia, in France under the Empire, and at one time in Ireland, should be allowed to grow up, to assume a number of posts in the executive branch. But it was only after Roosevelt was actually elected president in 1904 that he dared appoint a member of the Bonaparte family to a cabinet post. Bonaparte first served as the Secretary of the Navy, but in December 1906, Roosevelt appointed him as Attorney General of the United States. The two men did not waste any time in launching their own Bonapartist putsch. In 1908, Roosevelt and Bonaparte created a national secret police agency which leading congressional opponents of the day quite rightfully equated with the Tsarist Okhrana and the feared secret spy service of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte's police minister, Joseph Fouché. Later known as the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the Bureau of Investigations was established on July 1st, 1908 by executive fiat while the U.S. Congress was out of session and preoccupied with the upcoming national elections. The story of the founding of the FBI by Roosevelt and Bonaparte will sound particularly familiar to those who have experienced the police boot of COINTELPRO, Frumention, Abscam, Bry Lab, Waco, Ruby Ridge, the Office of Special Investigations, so-called Nazi hunts, the Get LaRouche Strike Force, and Whitewater Gate. On December 17, 1906, Charles Joseph Bonaparte was confirmed by the